Building well-rounded and three-dimensional delts can be a struggle for most people. Particularly, even developing them can be hard since most people struggle in fully hitting the side and posterior delt. Instead, people are often left with shoulders that don't pop. To address this, we need to understand the delt's anatomy, the regional differences, their biomechanical functions, and how we can practically apply this information. The deltoid, also known as the delts, is the muscle that lays at the top of the shoulder. While it is technically one muscle, it generally gets broken down into three, since there are roughly three different origins. The anterior head, starting on the lateral part of the clavicle, the middle head, starting on the acromion, and the posterior head, starting on the spine of the scapula. Collectively, these heads cross the glenohumeral joint and insert into the upper arm bone at the deltoid tuberosity. In addition to the different origins, we also see that each of these heads of the deltoid has slightly different functions. The anterior head functions more for shoulder flexion, horizontal adduction, internal rotation, and contributes to abduction. The middle head performs primarily shoulder abduction, with some contribution to other shoulder movements such as shoulder flexion. The posterior head does essentially the opposite of the anterior head, performing shoulder extension, horizontal abduction, external rotation, and contributing to abduction. Now, while we typically subdivide the delt into these three sections, research has identified that there are 7 subdivisions of the deltoid when looking at how these muscles function. This is important to know as it helps us in deciding which motions hit these different subdivisions and which ranges of motion and angles should be included in training. When we look at what the divisions research has found, we don't need to ditch the 3 categories that we just discussed before of anterior, middle, and posterior. Instead, it expands on it, showing that the middle and posterior divisions can actually be subdivided further into 2 and 4 subdivisions respectively. So we see it as 1 for the anterior, 2 for the middle, and 4 for the posterior. Again, some might not think this matters, but when we consider it, it actually helps us understand why we might want more variety of angles and exercises for the posterior delt versus the anterior delt or even the middle delt. As well, when we start to look at the biomechanical functions of each of the delt heads and subregions, along with the other muscles that do these motions, it helps us understand which ranges of motion are going to be best for hitting them. For instance, the anterior and middle delts contribute to shoulder flexion, but so does the pec. So when we do a motion like bench press, which has us flex our shoulder against resistance, we use all of these muscles. The bench is a good option for working the anterior and mid delt, but not emphasizing them. In contrast, the shoulder press does use the pec to a degree, but once you pass the head, it's relatively inactive, and the delts have to do more of the work then. Similarly, the lat and posterior delt are both shoulder extensors, but the lat works much more strongly at lower ranges of shoulder flexion and doesn't have as much ability to contribute at high ranges. Whereas the posterior delt is able to keep producing fairly significant force at high ranges of shoulder flexion to bring the arm back down, doing shoulder extension. This means if we want to emphasize the posterior delt, doing more end ranges of motion for shoulder extension would put more emphasis on it, such as pullovers or dead hang pull-ups and dead hang lat pull downs. As well, when looking at shoulder abduction, typically people think that this is just performed by the middle delt, but is actually performed by a lot of muscles such as the anterior delt, the supraspinatus, the trapezius, and a few others. There are various ways that we can preference the mid delt in this motion if that's desired, something we're going to discuss in a few minutes. Alright, let's get cracking with the exercises. First up, let's talk about the anterior delt. While people usually think that they need to be doing front raise variations to hit the anterior delt, research has regularly shown that we can more effectively hit it with compound pressing motions. When looking at the anterior delt, its fibers run in a pattern that allow it to get worked quite effectively through horizontal pressing actions such as dips, push-ups, bench press, and as we mentioned earlier, overhead pressing. So assuming you're regularly crushing pressing movements like the ones we listed, hitting at least 10 to 20 sets across a week, you don't need to do front delt isolation work. Instead, just focus on your pressing as you'll be stimulating it a lot with those movements. For the mid delt, it's very different. If you're doing exercises like overhead presses, you can bias the mid-delt over the front delt by shifting from a more forward elbow position to a more lateral elbow position throughout the press. But even with this, we still won't truly maximize the stimulus to it. Instead, some kind of lateral raise is pretty much a necessity. In fact, research has time and time again shown that the lateral raise destroys just about every other movement that can exist when it comes to the mid-delt. So ensuring that you have lateral raises in your program for hitting it is essential. With that said, there are various considerations in the execution of a lateral raise to make sure that you hit the mid-delt properly and maximally. First, you want to keep your arm as straight as you can. The more you bend your arm, the more you'll shift loading from the mid-delt to other muscles, such as the anterior delt or the rotator cuff muscles. Secondly, you want to think thumb down. When we look at the mid-delt fibers, having the thumb up will shift the fibers out of an optimal path to contract, and instead will load the anterior delt more. By going either palm flat or thumb pointing down, we can get the fibers in a more aligned path to ensure we hit it well. Thirdly, arms straight to the side. It's common to see people stand upright and bring their arms forward, but this actually will shift loading from the mid-delt and put it more towards either the supraspinatus or the anterior deltoid. Fourthly, have a slight forward lean. Due to the orientation and insertion of the mid-delt, it will get loaded more effectively if we have a forward shift, taking loading off the anterior delt. If you're wondering how much of a lean, honestly, it's hard to put an exact number or angle on it, but what I will say is that in the worst case scenario, if you go too far, you end up loading the posterior delt more, which isn't necessarily a bad thing since most people struggle with developing the mid and the posterior delt. Play around with angles and see what feels best. Using an incline bench can be handy for this, to have some extra chest support, allowing you to lean into it, and then you can experiment with which angle feels best, change the angles, and doing different reps. And then the fifth and final point for the lateral raise variations to consider is to reach out, not up. This might sound a little bit weird since we're obviously trying to lift our arms up, but since we really want to hit the mid-delts, we want to emphasize trying to move the arm and not the shoulder blades, because when the shoulder blades move up, it will utilize the traps to a much higher degree. If we try to just lift up, the shoulders will often shrug, having the scapula move and the traps more engaged. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it will make less specific loading to the delts. So reach out as you go up to help minimize that. Since we're discussing the best delt exercises, it's worth to then dig a little bit deeper and look at which might be the best lateral raise variations. While I do think that the standard dumbbell lateral raise done well is fantastic, the cable lateral raise might be slightly better. When we do a dumbbell lateral raise, we don't really get much challenge during the first roughly 45 to 60 degrees. In contrast with the cable version, we get worked right from the start of the motion. This means the mid-delt will be under tension through a greater range of motion, as well as have more of an even resistance through the motion. This may help lead to more hypertrophy over the long duration. When doing the cable lateral raise, you can stand with a split stance to help get the cable more in line with the fibers of the mid-delt. A second variation that builds off this is the leaning away lateral raise. This can be done with either dumbbells or cables, but again, you might be better off with cables where possible. The theory with this is that the supraspinatus is more dominant during the early portion of lifting the arm, so by going to an angled position, we can alter the range that we work through to help load the mid-delt more than the supraspinatus. Now, a question people commonly ask is what height should you stop at when doing lateral raises? A lot of the time, people will say just stop at shoulder height, but I don't necessarily agree with that. Firstly, if you look at the side hanging versions we discussed a moment ago, you're going to often take your arm up past shoulder height since you're usually going to go until your arm is about perpendicular to the floor. Secondly, I think that rotating through movements over time is best when it comes to hypertrophy, part of which is changing the ranges. Doing a fully overhead lateral raise, sometimes called a butterfly lateral raise, can be beneficial to challenge the muscles to work through a greater range overhead. I wouldn't call this a requirement, but I wanted to address this since people will likely ask. As we transition to the rear delts, it's one that's a bit of a mix between the anterior and mid delt. Like the anterior delt, it can get worked fairly well during compound movements. Specifically, doing rows, pull downs, pull-ups, etc. can work the posterior delt decently, but not to its highest degree, at least the way they're normally performed. The way that we execute these movements can heavily impact how much we work the posterior delts versus other muscles like the lats, traps, rhomboids. For instance, our lat is a primary muscle in these movements, sharing a role of shoulder extension with the posterior delt. If the lat is working to a really high degree, it can limit the focus and challenge to the posterior delt. To alter the lat's involvement, we can shift our elbow angle to a higher degree of abduction. We see that when the elbow is higher, the lats can't produce as much force. Similarly, when we do these movements, normally we focus on trying to retract our shoulder blades, which will heavily involve our traps, rhomboids, and other muscles in the upper back. If we instead focus on just pulling the elbows out and back, without emphasizing shoulder blades retracting, we can more heavily focus on the posterior delts to complete the motion. With these small changes in technique, we can make a row or a pull down an effective posterior delt exercise. Two of my favorite options to work the posterior delt to a high degree are the wide angle flat chest supported row, sometimes called a Helms row, but with the elbows flared. I like this a lot since you can let your chest lay on it, taking away any lower back loading, and let your shoulders wrap over it. Then from here we row wide and minimize our shoulders retracting back. This can be a really great option for loading the rear delts. A second favorite of mine is the high to low cross row with an angle. I particularly like to use it as a one-arm version to reduce the challenge with crossing your arms over and let you focus on one side at a time. The high to low aspect is really beneficial in getting more out of the posterior delt again, since it helps to put the posterior delt in a more lined position for creating tension. In addition to these rows and pull downs, doing some isolation type work for the rear delt can be beneficial. In particular, rear fly work is the gold standard. Now, the traditional reverse pec deck machine is fantastic. I definitely recommend people to use it if it's an option, but I personally don't have one, and most of my clients, friends, and other colleagues that I know don't have access to one. That's where these versions I'm going to show you come in. Firstly, if you do have access to a cable machine, you can do a cross-body reverse fly. This helps to isolate the main action of the posterior delt when it's loaded highest over other muscles. The cable works really well, like we discussed earlier, to load the delt through the motion. As you do this, it's best to use that slight high to low angle that we discussed earlier to challenge the fibers to contract in a more straight line. With this, you get more direct loading in the best line of action, so we can truly challenge the rear delt to the best degree. If you don't have a cable, then these next two are good options. Firstly, the classic bent over reverse fly or chest supported reverse fly can be a very effective option. The downside here is that much like the lateral raise with dumbbells, this only loads the top portion, which is likely not ideal. That's where combining this with a sideline rear delt raise can be a very effective option. In the sideline position, we now have the lengthened position of the rear delts being loaded the highest. This is in reverse to the last, which is beneficial for comprehensively working the rear delt. Now, these exercises so far are fantastic and definitely the best, but earlier I mentioned how the posterior delt has a lot of subdivisions, and we have one more motion which I want to discuss because it's going to round up this list. This is the full range pullover. That top range of motion is a position where the lats and other back muscles can't effectively contribute to bring the arms back towards the body, but the posterior delt gets worked fairly well here. It's a different angle and motion than the ones we previously discussed, which allows us to hit some of the different fibers of the posterior delt we didn't effectively hit earlier. We've actually made a whole video dedicated to the pullovers in the past because I'm such a big fan of them, so I'll put a link for that down in the description box below. Alright, let's summarize. The delts have three main divisions: the anterior, the middle, and the posterior. In addition, we can further subdivide the middle and the rear, suggesting it to be beneficial to use varying angles and ranges to best hit them. For the anterior, if you're doing lots of pressing movements, you likely don't need to do any additional work for it. For the middle head, you're going to want to do some specific lateral raise work. For the posterior head, doing some pull downs and rows will be good for it, but if you want to really hit it, make some modifications to your technique on those movements to do so, and consider adding in some reverse flies and some pullovers. Collectively, these will round out the best delt exercises. Thanks for watching, and we hope this video helps you in figuring out the best exercises for you. See you in the next video. Woo, baby!